All right, everybody. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight and joining us on our Owls Are Everyone speaker series. Our first session is on Indigenous people, land acknowledgements, and higher education. It'll be facilitated by Professor Kaiser Abdullah, who is wonderful enough to help us with many things DEI in our DEI sessions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Before I do, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just make sure that your speaker is on mute throughout the session. Have your video on if you can, just so we can see everybody's smiling faces if you're able to. If cats or children happen to go by, that's fine. We love those, or dogs. And also, if you have a question, please put it in the chat or do the hand raise so that we can sort of keep things moving. We will have time for questions towards the end, but we just want to be respectful of everybody's time. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Abdullah.
Thank you, Janine. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to this this iteration or this series that we're offering. We're really excited to start off with this particular topic. With us today, we have Caitlin Lucas. And also Dr. Nikki Michael. We'll have them introduce themselves because they are the best people to introduce themselves. They will let you know exactly, because I want you to understand why they are the ideal folks to lead this session for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin and Dr. Michael to lead us off with this really interesting and long overdue conversation in our alumni circle. So Caitlin and Dr. Michael.
Thank you. Dr. Michael, would you like to go first with the introduction?
Sure. Kulumosi hamohej, Silawensi o pataya lenape ni neguis, bikinun o Takkoken o Shakakahane, Nulalendam Eliapan. So I just wanted to share a little bit of our language with you. That is a language I learned from my people. Specifically, I spent several years with our last fluent speaker, Lucy Parks Blaylock, before she passed. And so that's how I came to be able to partially speak. I'm not fluent by any stretch of the imagination. We really do have no additional speakers that practice it today. But with that, I said that my Indian name, my Lenape name is White Flower Woman. Don't know why they named me that. Actually, I'll tell you a story. Like it's actually common for most Indigenous women, or at least the Lenape and Algonquin women, to have the flower in their name, and then the woman always comes at the end. So it's like if you want to say like cloud woman, it'd be Kumhokwe. So Kumhok would be the cloud, and then the Hwe would be the woman, and it's always followed by woman. Men, they have a different way of having names, but that's way more information than you guys probably want to have. So I'm already diving into the lecture, and I'd rather like turn it over to Caitlin and let her finish with her introduction.
Thanks, Dr. Michael. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen as I do my introduction here, so that I can make sure our PowerPoint is working correctly. So just give me a brief moment here. Okay, hopefully you all are seeing a slide that has Dr. Michael's and my name on them. So I am Caitlin Lucas. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here today. I'm actually a PhD candidate in Temple's English department. So I'm studying early American and Native American literatures. So I'm really excited to be speaking to Temple alum. And I also, and more importantly, work as Delaware Nation's Historic Preservation Officer. So Delaware Nation is one of the federally recognized Lenape tribal nations. And I'm stationed in their Homeland Extension Office, which is located on Lehigh University's campus in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I do want to be clear, I am not a tribal citizen, but in historic preservation work, we're responsible for really protecting a lot of the Lenape archaeological sites, sacred sites from harm or destruction. The Historic Preservation Office is also responsible for NAGPRA work, just so you have a little bit more understanding of what this office does. And so NAGPRA, for those who are not familiar, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so this mandated the return of Native American remains, funerary objects, and other sacred objects from federally funded institutions back to their rightful tribal nations. And so on top of those very important jobs, historic preservation, we also do a lot of educational work. Like this one, we also consult on museum exhibits and various other sorts of educational efforts. And we also consult very frequently on land acknowledgements, which is kind of how we fell into this conversation here today. So tonight we're going to give you sort of an overview of Lenape history, give you some key understanding of events that happened here in Lenapehoking, and who the Lenape tribal nations are today. And so hopefully that leads us into some further discussion about land acknowledgements and how to do Lenape land acknowledgements. And then I will turn things over to Dr. Michael, and she will lead us into some conversation about current issues that Lenape and Native students in general, students, faculty are facing in higher education today. So we're hoping to have plenty of time for questions at the end. So please hold them or put them in the chat, and we will get to them in the end. All right, so Dr. Michael and I are tag teaming this presentation today. So I'm gonna roll through these slides, and Dr. Michael, please jump in as you'd like. So to start us off here, really the most foundational component of doing land acknowledgements, I would say, is being able to properly identify the tribal nations whose lands you're standing on. So the lands many of you probably work and live on, including Temple University, is part of Turtle Island, and specifically the homelands of the Lenape people, called Lenapehoking. The Lenape are the ancestral indigenous inhabitants and caretakers of what are now Eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and parts of New York, Maryland, and Connecticut since time immemorial. Lenape is also the name of their language, and the Delaware and the Lenape are the same people. You may have seen these terms used interchangeably, and the term Delaware is used in a lot of the federally recognized Lenape tribal nations titles, even though this is the colonial term. So the Lenape became collectively referred to as the Delaware by European colonists because of their proximity to the Delaware River. They were living all along the Delaware River in the Delaware Valley, and Europeans had named this after their first governor of Virginia, whose name was Thomas West, the third Baron Delaware. But so the correct term that the people use to refer to themselves is simply Lenape. So that's what we try to use most frequently. There was no singular or unified Lenape nation historically, and there isn't today. We have multiple different communities throughout their homeland region. Historically, these communities in the homelands would share Lenape culture. They shared dialects of the Lenape language. Munsee was typically spoken in the north and Unami in the south. And each community would usually have different sakima or leaders, but they would often convene at council fires to discuss major decisions or events that would affect all of the community as a whole. So they did acknowledge each other as relations, and the tribes still do today. And so these Lenape tribal nations are still here today, and they have maintained their community, culture, and sovereignty despite centuries of settler colonial violence and dispossession. So this history is what we're going to delve into in a little bit more detail, reviewing some of the key events of this legacy of settler colonialism, which really resulted in Euro-Americans occupying these lands today, while the Lenape were repeatedly fractured and forced out along a trail of broken treaties. So today's federally recognized Lenape tribal nations, you can see them on this slide here. These are the tribal nations who've endured centuries of forced removals from their homelands. And you can see they eventually settled in parts of Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Canada, where their tribal governments are based out of today. So these are Delaware Nation, who I work for, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, who Dr. Michael is a citizen of, the Stockbridge Munsee as well. Those are the three in the United States. And then there are the Delaware Nation of Moravian Town and the Munsee Delaware Nation in Canada. And so these federally recognized Lenape nations are the only ones who've proved their continuation of culture, community, and sovereignty throughout history, as well as their citizenship as Lenape people determined by their own tribe's requirements. So these are the only Lenape nations who work on that government-to-government level with the United States, and they maintain relationships with their homelands, even though most of their citizens and their governments are no longer situated there. Though most of them, a lot of them do have extension offices in their homeland region. But we often hear people, in historic preservation work, I'm sure Dr. Michael's heard this, people often say, why doesn't Pennsylvania recognize any tribes? I don't know whose land I'm on, there's no tribes here. But I want to emphasize that these federally recognized Lenape tribes have always been recognized at the federal level as the indigenous peoples of Eastern Pennsylvania and the rest of their homeland region. And they've always been consulting in these states for the protection of their homelands, their ancestors, and on educational efforts about their histories. So the idea of state recognition for them is sort of unnecessary and irrelevant here. And something else I want to note too, while we're kind of on this subject, multiple of the federally recognized Lenape nations have actually issued governmental resolutions that they only acknowledge and work with other federally recognized tribal nations. And so this is in response to the increasing problem of fraudulent claims to Lenape identity. And so this is a real threat to Lenape sovereignty and culture, and this is a threat that's facing tribal nations across the country, not just the Lenape. So I do just want to point this out. It is a big issue right now. You may see some of these issues discussed in recent news. And so for the Lenape, this means that they do not acknowledge as kin or work with any of the state or non-federally recognized groups that claim Lenape identity, some of which operate in Lenape homelands. So just kind of keep that in mind. And if you have questions, we can address those later. So this is the Lenape tribal nations today. So now, to unpack how the Lenape came to be removed from their homelands and spread across the continent, for the sake of time, I begin by talking about William Penn, though I do want to acknowledge it's problematic to start with William Penn because the Lenape, of course, have an extensive history prior to European contact and also during the earlier stages of settler colonialism with the Dutch and the Swedish colonies that came before the English. So if you're interested in that history, I have a few books I can recommend to you. But I begin with Penn here because it's his legacy that really dominates the popularized narratives of Pennsylvania's history, especially in Philadelphia, of course. And it's his heirs which really spurred Lenape persecution and removal in many ways. So after the English conquered the earlier Dutch and Swedish colonies of what is now Eastern Pennsylvania around 1664 or so, the King of England claimed ownership of Lenape territory. William Penn, who was a wealthy Quaker at the time, was granted a charter to found his holy experiment in America. So he was planning on creating a colony based on what he believed to be his principles of religious and civic freedom and justice. The image on this slide is from Benjamin West's 1771 painting. It's called Penn's Treaty with the Indians. And so this is one of those largely fictionalized images we get of this event, which contributed to that popularity of the story of Penn's Treaty. So this treaty is also known as the legendary Treaty of Shakamaxon. It has a few different names. And this was supposedly made between William Penn and the Lenape after he arrived in Pennsylvania around 1682, around the Fishtown district of Philly. But in many cases like this one, the historic written document of his dealings with the Lenape has been lost. The story of this treaty was amplified and it was often fictionalized through literature and artwork in the 18th and 19th centuries, like this one and the one on the previous. And a lot of these are highly inaccurate. They're stereotypical, which is also worth pointing out as well. And in the smaller picture on this slide, you can see what Lenape Chief Tamanen's signature looked like from a 1683 deed. He was supposedly the one who made this original treaty with William Penn, though we don't have any surviving portraits of him. We do, however, have multiple wampum belts that survived through the Penn family as physical Lenape evidence of these diplomatic relationships with the Penn and the Lenape. So wampum are these purple and white beads made from the quahog shell, which were valued because they were used for these treaty belts. To represent these histories, really document these histories and be gifted at treaty negotiations. In 1857, one of Penn's descendants donated the wampum belt in the top left image to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This is probably the most famous Lenape wampum belt, supposedly given to William Penn at that famous treaty. And it's now on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I think it's still on display there in their new early American exhibition space. And so that's worth pointing out too, because the PMA actually consulted with the historic preservation offices of the federally recognized Lenape tribes to work on that exhibit. So worth pointing out and worth going to see if you have a moment to do so. So overall, these wampum belts may stand as evidence that Penn had some sort of dealings, possibly promoted some sort of goodwill towards the Lenape people, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have gifted him these belts. But I think it's seriously remiss to characterize his relationship with the Lenape as one of pure innocence or beneficial friendship, as a lot of these narratives of Pennsylvania's history do. When we look at what Penn was doing, right, his intent was certainly still to really ultimately dispossess the Lenape of vast swaths of their homelands, whether he did it, nicely or not. And much of Pennsylvania's public history fails to reflect critically on really what the motives were here and these histories that have been so sort of sensationalized. And Dr. Michael, please feel free to jump in. I'm trying to keep an eye on you and see if you want to add. Okay, so the walking purchase. So of course, William Penn's legacy is further complicated by really his son's actions. And so his sons are most infamous for what is known as the walking purchase, or perhaps as the Lenape communities often refer to it, the running purchase, the walking theft. I've heard a lot of different names for that. So after William Penn dies around 1718, his sons take charge of Pennsylvania and really disrupted whatever peaceful relations may have existed still between them and the Lenape. And so they're trying to deal with massive debts that they were inheriting from their father. So in 1735, James Logan and Thomas Penn presented Lenape chiefs with a fraudulent record of a 1686 land transaction in which William Penn had supposedly already purchased a tract of land from the Lenape. The language in this fake document said that this land tract had been defined by, quote, as far as a man can go in a day and a half. And it was exactly that vague language. So unbeknownst to the Lenape, the Pennsylvania proprietors had already conducted trial walks. They had done surveys to really parcel out which pieces of land they wanted to take from them. And that's basically what they were pretending that they already owned through this fake document. So there was much dispute over this document, but eventually the proprietors convinced the Lenape to agree to redefine the boundaries of this tract that they wanted to take by conducting a walk, which they were going to do by this misleading language in the document, as far as a man can go in a day and a half. So in carrying out the walk, the proprietary agents exploited this agreement, and they were employing this intentionally vague and sort of confusing language, which really would not have translated well or clearly into the Lenape language. So there was a lot of levels of deception going on here. When the walk happened, a lot of it was conducted out of the sight of Lenape observers. Their walkers were really running at various points. They took disagreed upon trajectories that they didn't expect them to take. There was a lot of different assaults here as the walk happened, all of which the Lenape were protesting from the day it happened through present day today. There was even a royal inquiry petitioned by Ben Franklin to investigate this event in its day, after which the Penn sons were later charged with having forged that deed. But yet there's still no justice for the stolen land, right? So actually today, the walking purchase is often still unacknowledged. Its fraudulence is not acknowledged. And many students today are still not even taught about this event, frequently leaving them to sort of think the Lenape are that stereotypical vanished Indian, right? If they even know that the Lenape were present in Pennsylvania at all. And that's a good image of the walking purchase there. It's a little blurry, but it shows you it's really a massive quantity of land that was taken through that. So there's a lot of dismal reminders of the walking purchase that linger across many of the Pennsylvania counties it encompassed, including Bucks, Lehigh, Northampton, and Carbon counties. I have a few of them pictured here. And I just point out these markers because they're really symptomatic of the neglect of this event in contemporary Pennsylvania public memory, education systems, and they dramatically ignore the Indigenous perspective of this story. To the Lenape today, of course, this is a much more crucial and enduring conflict, the consequences of which are still being felt and dealt with. Jumping to more recent times for a moment, in 2004, Delaware Nation actually sued the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to try and reclaim lands for which they argued the chain of title was breached through this fraudulent walking purchase. This lawsuit never went to trial. The judge ruled that the walking purchase was non-justiciable, that the outcome of the matter could not change. And while the court importantly did not deny that fraud was involved in the walking purchase, they did claim this fraud was irrelevant because, quote, the son of William Penn had the legal and sovereign authority to take the land, which of course we know is an extremely problematic assertion to say the least, rooted in that doctrine of discovery ideology, right? So this lawsuit interestingly reactivated tensions from this colonial past for modern Pennsylvania residents who were reminded for a hot second that they all live on stolen land, right, in all of those counties. But for Delaware Nation, this lawsuit is really part of a long story of protests of the walking purchase since 1737, and also a reminder of the difficulty of enforcing accountability for these injustices in the present. And this is also a great example of how these historic events and Pennsylvania's narratives of its history are still affecting Lenape people today and public policy today. So returning to the years following the walking purchase, Pennsylvania's settler-native relations are in increasing turmoil, especially as the French and Indian War begins in 1754. And these events really inspire a series of massacres leading up to the foundation of the United States. The Lenape are caught up in all of this violence, and they do side with the French in this war as a result of the walking purchase. A lot of Lenape leaders cited that as a direct reason why they did not want to support the British. In 1756, Pennsylvania's government authorized Captain Wayne of Northampton County to offer bounties on Native people's heads, and Lenape chiefs had even higher bounties on them. So this was a really dangerous time to be a Lenape person, if it wasn't always. So in 1763, Ottawa Chief Pontiac inspired Pan-Native unity, and he inspires uprisings throughout the Great Lakes regions to protest the British policies after the French and Indian War. Using his movement sort of as an inspiration to take genocidal action against all Native people, 50 armed settlers from Paxton massacred the Conestoga Indian town. And this was a community of peaceful intertribal Native refugees, which included Seneca citizens, Delaware Lenape citizens, Shawnee, and the last remaining Susquehannock people. So these peaceful communities are getting caught up in this violence. And similarly, later in 1782, Pennsylvania militiamen kill approximately 96 Lenape people at Nadenhooten, which is in eastern Ohio. That's what the monument on this slide is from. Again, this was another peaceful Moravian mission town. So just really to show you the sort of racial violence that's going on at this time period amidst these Lenape removals after the walking purchase. So in the midst of all this violence, the Revolutionary War breaks out. Negotiations occur at Fort Pitt in 1778, and these are convened by the United States after they're watching a lot of tribal nations ally themselves with the British. Lenape communities at this time had divided allegiances. Some were trying to remain neutral during the war. They had clashed with other Native tribes as they sought to reestablish themselves in Ohio after being removed from their homelands. And a lot of their interests were in protecting these new lands that they had in Ohio country. So the Lenape agreed to make this Fort Pitt Treaty, which was the first treaty between the new United States and the Native nation. And this treaty recognized the Lenape as a sovereign nation, as all treaties do. But this also encouraged the formation of a state headed by the Lenape with representation in Congress, among other things. Of course, the United States did not uphold their end of this treaty, while the Lenape did hold up their end, which actually helped the United States to win the Revolutionary War. And so, jumping to the next photo here. In 2018, the Fort Pitt Treaty went on display at the Smithsonian. Though this does remain a broken treaty, the Lenape nations are very proud to have made this first treaty with the United States. So in 2018, current Lenape tribal leaders went to DC to witness the unveiling of this treaty their ancestors made as it was installed in the exhibition. And so you can see them all pictured here. Very significant treaty, and a lot of folks don't know about the Fort Pitt Treaty, so I always like to bring that up. So after the Revolutionary War and the broken Treaty of Fort Pitt, the Lenape continued to be driven further and further away from their homelands out of Ohio. And there's a really long trail of broken treaties evidencing these various forced migrations of the Lenape, all of which was accompanied by ongoing protests from their leadership. And of course, we don't have time to really cover in detail this massive, really centuries of history here. So I use this map to kind of give you an idea of these different movements of how the tribes ended up where they are today. And so, of course, the main governing bodies, you can see they ultimately settle in Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, where they still exist as sovereign nations today. And I wanted to ask if Dr. Michael wanted to chime in any comments on any of these other various treaties that you wanted to sum up here. I know it's a humongous history to try and cover.
It really is. You did a fantastic job. Always so proud of your the way you articulate and express the unfairness, especially. In my last presentation, somebody asked me how we felt about William Penn. And, it was really kind of a thought-provoking question. As you would think we'd have thought about it, but we haven't, because really we've just spent so much time trying to recover. But if I were to say what the feeling about him is, even if he was kind, that whole conquer by kindness kind of thing, I think in some ways it's almost better to know that, your enemy, so his sons were actually very open about being anti-Delaware. So I think that was an easier, not saying that was right, but an easier pill to swallow versus, his father, who was trying to supposedly be fair with us. And in Indigenous perspectives, friendship, they're not like friendships today. We have friends that we may grow up with them. We may even keep track of them on Facebook or other social media. But friends, when we're in a relationship, they're stronger than even a marriage. That friendship for any people especially was like lifelong. That meant you would sit, when that person died, for those 3 days of the funeral, that, it was a very, very close relationship. So the point being, when my ancestors were thinking of these relationships with these newcomers, they were thinking in Lenape terms, friendships, closeness. So it was a real jarring for them to understand and get the kind of the treatment that they got from them.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Michael. I think we are going to turn to land acknowledgements after this. So I didn't know if there was any other points you wanted to touch on the history before we kind of move on there.
Not necessarily. I would just, really express that resistance comes in many different ways and forms. And so while we were victims in a really strong and horrible kind of removal process, but we are also very strong. We're what they call the products of our strongest ancestors. And so when I talk to my kids or when I talk to our students, I want them to understand, yes, this happened, but you are strong. You have come from some good genetic background that enabled them to survive to bring you here and in this world today.
Yeah, thank you. And please, if you have questions about the history slides, please put them in the chat and we will return to that later. I'm going to dive into land acknowledgements now. So I know land acknowledgements are a bit of a hot topic right now. They have been for a little while. The Historic Preservation Office gets inquiries about these all the time. So what are these? You know, I think they really have gained in popularity over the past few years. I'm not sure when they really emerged, but largely in academic circles, I see them being used mostly. And I think in their most basic form, they're just these formal statements that are usually given before some type of public event. Could be a conference. I've seen them used in a bunch of different forms, sometimes in written forms. But fundamentally, I think they should do three things, which I kind of have outlined here. They should name who the specific tribal nations are whose lands you're standing on or occupying, who you're trying to acknowledge. Two, they should speak to what settler colonial injustices and or broken treaties occurred in your specific location, the specific location you're trying to acknowledge, and how did these events impact the tribal nations and their homelands. And so if you're talking about tribal nations that have been removed forcibly from these lands, note where they're located today, note those histories. And then the third component, I think, is that there needs to be some sort of identification about how this is a living relationship between these tribal nations and their homelands today. Even if these tribal nations were displaced, thinking about how that connection is ongoing and speaking to what you can do to help facilitate reciprocity with these tribal nations in your current position. And also thinking about how you can do this in perpetuity for future generations, not just you in your current position now, but for those who come after you, what can you kind of do to keep that relationship going? So for Lenape land acknowledgement specifically, that would name all the federally recognized Lenape tribal nations you saw in the slides we presented, and probably would reference a lot of the historical events I spoke about in the talk as well, which forcibly removed the Lenape people from their homelands. Might look a little bit different if you're giving one for New Jersey than it does for Eastern Pennsylvania, but this one's pretty Eastern Pennsylvania specific. So after consulting on a lot of these land acknowledgements in the Historic Preservation Office for the past few years, we kind of compiled this basic list of do's and don'ts for doing land acknowledgements, which have seemed to be helpful for folks. So I hope all of you can find some use out of this as well. I'll run through these quickly, but please feel free to note questions about this. We can return to this later, have some more discussion. But basically, for the land acknowledgements should column. These usually, I think, should be given by non-Native folks, and Dr. Michael, feel free to chime in, but non-Native folks are typically the ones who need to learn from this experience, right? We need to figure out how to acknowledge the tribal nations whose lands we're occupying, the histories that we may or may not be familiar with. And you know, the Lenape tribal nations know who they are. They know who where their homelands are and what happened to them. So they don't need to be the ones giving those acknowledgements unless they want to, of course. So if you think you want to give a land acknowledgement or you want to establish a protocol for an acknowledgement in your organization, I always tell folks to first reach out directly to the federally recognized tribal nations you're trying to acknowledge if you can. Learn their history directly from them if you can. Name them specifically in your acknowledgement. The tribal historic or cultural preservation offices are usually the best points of contact to reach out to for this, I would think. Typically, they have contact information on their tribal government websites. But do keep in mind their offices are usually extremely busy. You may not receive a response as quickly as you'd like. They're not working on academic time. You know, they have more pressing tribal government duties to take care of that have to take precedent. So try to be patient if you're trying to get in contact with them. Be kind and don't be afraid to follow up more than once. I know I always appreciate multiple emails to make sure I'm receiving something. So yes, I encourage you to reach out if you can, but don't be surprised if it's difficult to get in touch and just be patient. That being said, I think it's also really important that you work to do your best to do research on your own, right? Bring something to the table, have some sort of a starting point before you meet with tribal representatives so that you're not putting all of that burden on them to educate you. And also remembering, as you're doing that research, the goal of land acknowledgements, I think, is to tell the truth about how Native peoples have been treated. Their histories have all too often been marginalized, if not erased altogether. So really important that your acknowledgement is naming specific broken treaties or other historical events which directly impacted those tribal nations you're talking about. And again, bringing back that living component. So these acknowledgements should be living in the sense that they're conveying this ongoing responsibility to build these relationships and maintain these relationships with the tribal nations whose lands you're on. So we don't want to just be giving these as a one-off box check, right? It should be a living relationship. And kind of piggybacking off of that, maybe most importantly, land acknowledgements should lead to real action. I know within my own historic preservation office and among many other Native scholars, we're seeing these increasing frustrations and criticisms of land acknowledgements for being performative, for being generalized to the point where they're not really helpful, or sometimes historicized and they're not actually naming or recognizing who the tribal nations are today, which is also a problem. And when they don't have any real meaningful benefit to these living tribal nations who are supposed to be being acknowledged, what's kind of the point, right? You know, what is this actually achieving? So on whatever scale you can, I think it's important to speak to how you might plan to create long-term reciprocal action for the tribal nations you're naming. How can you promote equity? How can you promote social justice? How can you support tribal sovereignty or push back against erasure in whatever level or form you can in your organization? So those are all the do columns. And so as far as the don'ts columns, I kind of touched on a few of these, but I'll just roll through these too. You don't want these to be superficial or shallow, right? You want to have that meaningful action. You don't want to give land acknowledgement if you're just using it for tokenism or some sort of financial or PR gain, right? Native folks should be the ones benefiting from this, not you for speaking land acknowledgement, right? Don't give them if your intention is not to maintain some sort of working relationship with Native peoples. Obviously, kind of given, don't use stereotypes, don't misrepresent, don't use incorrect historical information. And if you're unsure about whether something you're saying is accurate, then that's why it's crucial to speak with those tribal nations directly if you can get a hold of them. Don't single, on the other hand, right, don't single out or expect Indigenous peoples to always be informants for you or to educate you on their entire history. That's why you got to come to the table with something to offer, some background knowledge, that reciprocity, right? You don't want to copy and paste an acknowledgement from someone else unless you've had a conversation about, you know, what that means or you've partaken in that process. And of course, you don't want to promise actions or statements that you can't actually deliver. So think about how you can be realistic about what you might be able to do in your position. And I would say too, if your answer is that you can't take any real action or that you have had no contact with any of these tribal nations that you're trying to talk about, you might want to reconsider why you're giving this acknowledgement or what your process has been for doing that acknowledgement. And I think that's all my main points, but I want to pause and see if Dr. Michael has some additions here.
I think a little story might be in order here.
Sure.
Well, first I wanted to go back. I remembered what I forgot to say in the first part was part of what I would ask you to think about is what it was like for our people to go from a coastal fishing and hunting society all the way through 5, 6, 7, 8 states sometimes to become Plains people who were very much alike with the other Plains nations, only we had to do it in a shorter period of time. But what that also meant was we lost a lot of our foods, our nutrition sources, our medicines, because all of those things, all of those essential life forces were in one spot, right? That's those spaces that we occupied, we knew them well, and we had a relationship, what they call ecology now. And so we had to relearn that every time we moved. And that was not an easy task, and it wasn't just a matter of like picking up and moving from states like we do today. It was the whole, pharmaceutical. We would have had to take a Walgreens with us if we, you know. So I just want you to think about that also, because land acknowledgements are supposed to be able to express that. It's a way of expressing that loss at the same time, that gain, that regaining of that relationship. And our people want nothing more than to be able to go back home and gather wampum and make those beads again, and be able to fish with the nets that we used to make, and just to have that connection and that camp life. I seriously can say that most of our people would much rather live that way than how we're living today. And so when you say, okay, we want to acknowledge the very land that our Lenape people were on, I would ask you to consider those things. I would also express to you that there are plenty of folks out there that are using these things for financial gain. One, not too recently, was a very shocking and upsetting one. And it was about the Muncies, actually. They said that they had worked with the Muncies to come up with their land acknowledgement. I actually really liked the acknowledgement, but I was like, who did you talk to? Because you know what? We all talk to each other. It wasn't always that way, like there were certain times that we all had falling out, but for the most part now we're really unified, and I love seeing that. So, and I'm like, where did they talk to this person at, and what did they say? And then I did not get the feedback that I was thinking that they were saying happened. We got the feedback that no, we don't know who those folks are. Okay, well, that's not a good sign. So then I find out that they have done this land acknowledgement, and they're creating an Indigenous studies. And they have a handful of self-identified Native students out of thousands, like tens and 20,000 students. And they're getting millions of dollars for it. And why that's so egregious is because we have students here that don't get anything. And we have Indigenous studies. We don't have to create it. We have all the people. We have all the things that we need right here to do it. So it's these are starting to be used as tools against us, and it may not be something overt. It may not be on purpose, but it's kind of the same thing. We're not in the visibility of these foundations that are giving to these universities and colleges, and that really is going to hurt us in the long run.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Michael. I think that segues nicely into the next sort of topic about higher education. I think, do you want me to open up your PowerPoint so that we can talk more about that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sharing here for a minute and bring that one up. Okay.
This will also be more towards a kind of a conversational piece. We got through the historical part, we're kind of defining what land acknowledgements are, a little bit about the do's and don'ts, but how does that impact us today? And so in education, I'm the interim president of Bacone College. I got here by way of being the Indigenous Studies Curriculum Executive Director of Curriculum, and the Native American Studies Chair. So 2 big titles that meant that I knew what I was doing. But I'm telling you, running a college is really, really a lot more intense than I had ever dreamed it would be, and especially when it's an Indigenous serving institution. So that's where I'm at, and that's the perspective I'm coming from. But I'm also going to say that I came this way through some very heartbreaking kind of experiences in higher education. Whether that be from when I got my doctorate, they told me I was expressing just one side of the story. Which, yeah, I don't know who's been doing that the last 500 years. And that I would never become and this is a group of older white men, basically. So it was a time that women were starting to become historians, but of course, breaking through those barriers was pretty tough. And I had to have someone by the name of Dr. Robert Worrier, who was at OU at the time. He became my hero, basically. And that's why when you have somebody in your committees that is from an Indigenous community, they can go and make sure that you're treated right. And he's one of those that did, and I would not be I would not be here today, and I would not be doing the things I'm doing today without his intervention. And he made them do it right. So I finally did graduate, but that wasn't the end of it. Becoming a single mom and trying to be a professor was also another shock because, it's not, academia is not meant for kids. It's not meant for a family. And Indigenous peoples, like many peoples across the world, not just Indigenous peoples, were very family oriented, right? So, I mean, I even know people today, some of my friends, Pawnees, I don't know why I have to, I'm just going to make them an example. Is this Pawnee family I know that goes everywhere together. And I'm not talking about 5 or 6 of them. We're talking about 12, 15 of them. We'll even go to a conference of some sort, and they'll all be piling out of that same room. And the reason, I mean, it's kind of funny, but it is really similar to like losing one of your limbs. If one of those people wasn't there, if your family wasn't there, you don't function the same way, you don't feel the same way. And so I really have to think about that when I'm in my classrooms, especially with Indigenous students, because they're one person, but they come from a whole lot of people and a whole lot of well-wishers. And, so the pressure's on them when they're in the classroom. They're the elders' hopes and dreams, but getting them through is really, really another story. And so if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, I want to start out with what our actual Indigenous studies was. And today we have fancy words for it. We have this word called pedagogies. And it's actually, it's been around for a long time, but it seems to be really connecting with higher ed in the last 5-10 years, especially when we're talking about Indigenous ways of thinking, Indigenous ways of being. So here's one that, I think it was true to form to say it's not fully, but it might be defined as those that emerge from and center the peoplehood, cultures, values, and intellectual traditions of the Indigenous communities in relation to the particular places those communities come from. So it's tied to not just the family, but those places, meaning our plant relatives, our root relatives, our animal relatives, and our flyers. Okay, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, what is in our what is the original Lenape studies? Anybody ever think about something like this? What do you think might be part of our original Lenape studies? Just based on what we've gone over so far. Don't be afraid. Anybody? No one wants to guess? I'm not making you think. Okay, well, let's go for the first slide and we'll see if there's any more. Oh, here's one centered more on the colonist. Well, yeah, most of it has been centered on the colonist perspective. Okay, let's try the first slide. Go ahead. Oral history, yes, excellent. But also even further back than that, and that is the basic elements. This is water. And water in our indigenous ways is medicine. In fact, our word bi, MPI, bi, is also in the word medicine, bisun, bisun. And this is what we use when we go into sweat. It's what our elders said to do the first thing in the morning is to say a prayer and drink water. And so that is one of the first elements of Lenape studies. Okay, go ahead and go to the next one. Fire, Tindai. Oops. There you go. So we have what are called stomp dances. And our stomp dances today are not quite like they were in probably the 1950s. However, we're actually able to do them out in the open, whereas in the 1950s, 1920s, we were having to do them underground. Basically, they were against the law all the way up until 1978, when the Indian Religious Freedom Act occurred. That meant our dances could come out of hiding. But for the most part, we still do these in hiding in very hard to find places. Because we're dancing around the fire all night, and there are certain things that go along with them. Green corn particularly, there's a lot of sacrifice, and children are basically a part of that, but mainstream society would probably not be too happy to see some of the things that our kids do. It's not a bad thing, it's just that there are various perspectives on what happens when you want to give some sacrifice of yourself to the benefit of your people. Okay, the next slide, please. Kahesena Haki, Mother Earth. So this is an important one because you can see that she's picking up the soil, and of course that's our mother. That's and you can think about how water, if you picked up water, it would go through your hands. The same thing happens with soil. It just goes through your hands. But it's a little bit more solid. But it's another element. All of this wrapped up in the original indigenous perspectives. And Mother Earth created life for us. That's where we're living. She's the original woman. And if people treat her bad, then they more than likely will treat a woman bad. And I think that stands to reason for many of us to think in those terms. We've seen it happen, actually, because the more distant we are from that connection to Mother Earth, the less we have empathy for what's going on around us. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then I also want to include the 4 directions, because when we give thanks, when we give tobacco, when we do any sort of prayer, whether we're using our pipe, we give thanks to each of the 4 directions. Each of those directions is going to mean something different, and including the sky and the earth, and then ourselves. Okay, go ahead. Next slide. Now, why we start there is because from that point forward, we're learning from each other. We're learning from our elders, particularly. We're learning from our aunties and our uncles. And this is what our original classroom looked like. It wasn't indoors. It wasn't a square. It didn't have boundaries. We were able to go out in the field, and if we were a young lady, we would be with our aunties, and we probably were picking blueberries. Blueberries. And we were probably singing a song that goes along with harvesting. And for the boys, it was often they would go out with their uncles or their grandfathers, and they would teach them to give credit to that animal, to give thanks to that animal for giving that life for us to be able to eat. So they were taught these things from a very early age, and they practiced by doing it. And then the seasons were also cyclical, so that certain things were done at certain times. So somebody mentioned earlier about oral histories. Yes, oral histories were strongly included in this. In fact, I can sometimes, it's not always, but in general, I can have a classroom full of Native students and give them that phone exercise where you whisper in one person's ear and they turn around and whisper in the other person's ear, and it goes around through 20 people, right? And what normally happens at the end? Is it the same thing? Yeah, not usually, not usually, but there's something different, and even surprising sometimes when it is Native students. Now, sometimes it doesn't work, but a number of times it has worked, that their brains are wired for oral history. So a lot of times you'll have somebody, a young person that's maybe misdiagnosed as ADHD or something like that, or dyslexic, but boy, they should sure orally tell you everything. It's like, well, why is that? It's because their brains are wired a certain way. Is that a bad thing? No, it just means that there are thousands and thousands of years going into the development of that brain structure. And often that came from being very close to, the grandparents who told those stories, and then you need to repeat those stories when you're an adult, but you don't veer from those stories. Those are the actual ones. And how do you remember them? Because, well, we're repeating them often enough, but also because we remember them. That word is embedded in our brain. And then there's also not just cyclical, as in there's spring, winter, fall, but there's also the times of like life. So during the springtime, that's kind of symbolic of the birth time. Then of course, the fall and the summer are going to be your middle-aged folks, and of course, by the time you get to the winter, that is an elder. Okay, go ahead and go to the next one. I think that might be it. Is that? Nope, I got one more. So I want to leave you with this. Again, I don't want to end this by any stretch of the imagination, but this is an opener for discussion. And then we're going to go into like what it's like for faculty and students today. But this is our original professor, right? This is an elder. And it's important to understand that there are older people, there are elders, and there are elders. Kate's smiling a little. She's probably had a taste of both, especially being with the Delawares down there. There's lots of Kiowas and Comanches down there. And so you can get some angry elders, but most elders, they may be very assertive and maybe sometimes even aggressive about things, but most of the time they're going to be sweet. And they're going to want the best for you. And they're going to call you honey and sweetheart and show nothing but love. But, again, they would be very lovingly telling you how you should be doing something. And so that is why I chose this picture, because I felt like she was, and she's a Lenape. Actually, she is from the Western Delaware, too. She was sitting out front. And, so those are the times we would sit around and listen to Grandma. She'd show us what she was doing, maybe making kahakan. But the original professors weren't those that went to school to get their PhD. They were the ones that had lived life and gathered wisdom.